everybody. This is Chris
and Kathy.
We wanted to take a minute to thank you all for tuning in. We appreciate every listener and are grateful for this platform.
Please help us share our vision by subscribing to our show through your favorite streaming app. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube at Petability Podcast.
Check out our ever-growing list of affiliates and sponsors. Simply go to the show notes for information and links.
And be sure to use our promo code PETPOD22, that's PETPOD22, on checkout to receive your discount from our affiliates. And now, here's a word from our sponsor.
Hi, I'm Alon Landa, CEO of MedcoVet, and I'm a proud sponsor of Petability. We decided to partner with Chris and Kathy because, like them, we want to empower all pet owners who are trying to do the most for their pets. At MedcoVet, we specialize in advanced home laser therapy for pets. Laser therapy is a safe and effective treatment for common conditions like arthritis and wounds, and it relieves pain for most conditions caused by inflammation. With MedcoVet, pet owners can perform this treatment at home while receiving support from experienced clinicians. If you think your pet would benefit from healing at home, visit medcovet.com, and one of our clinical experts will work with you to determine if home laser therapy is the right fit for you and your pet. Tell them Petability sent you.
Good afternoon, Chris. How you doing over there?
Kathy, I'm great. Yeah, I'm going to just get right to it today because this is a rescheduled recording of our podcast, and I can't wait any longer. It's already been over a month in the making. So today, I'm going to talk to, this is kind of fun. Ready? Disaster Patrick.
Great name. Great.
I know. And as Disaster Patrick says, prepare for a disaster and you'll never experience one, right? So we learned about him because he's been intimately involved in pet rescues, right? Because when I first got the information, I was like, well, I'm not really sure if this is going to fit into our pet-oriented podcast. But the more I researched, the more I realized that it does. So if he could describe how we would best prepare our pets for potential disasters. You know, what common mistakes are made? What are the frequent challenges? And what can pet parents do in advance to make it the most success possible?
You remember Katrina and how haunting it is to see those images of dogs and cats, stranded. And I think that there are people that didn't leave their pets that day because they didn't want to leave them stranded. And so it's best to be prepared, and there's best to have an evacuation plan. And I actually got a little bit of this information when I was in vet tech school, and you would not believe the things that Disaster Patrick would have to pull together to get these animal rescues. So I'm really interested to hear what he has to say. Very interested.
Yeah. I know. I think Katrina shifted our mindsets for a lot of us, and it's hard to believe that was how long ago now? Over 20 years, for
20
sure.
years, I think. Yeah.
But yeah, people didn't leave their pets, or when they did, the PTSD from not only having your home destroyed, but potentially losing your pet. And I think we learned that many times the pets survived, but they couldn't be reconnected with their people. So I think there were many, many lessons learned there. After so many pets were forever separated from their people or ultimately perished. And you and I both volunteered with Best Friends, and the ASPCA and other larger animal welfare organizations develop policies and procedures to better handle such situations going forward. So before we get much further into it, let me just share a short bio. Patrick Hardy, also known as Disaster Patrick, is not the typical disaster expert. He's no doom and gloom, no scare tactics, just real actionable insights from the forefront of the world's toughest disaster challenges. Between setting the world record for 28 hours of nonstop CPR, building emergency shelters with Lego blocks, and evacuating 240 cats in 90 minutes, that's the one I want to really hear about. Disaster Patrick's mission is to push the edge of what's possible in preparing for disaster. So many things come to mind, right? Like, how is a disaster actually defined? Does the type of disaster make a difference regarding the preparation? And I imagine the type of animals being prepared for a predicted or surprise disaster makes a big difference. Today, we're going to be focusing on small animals, as I mentioned. When is evacuation necessary, and what does that look like when it comes to our pets? So again, I'm very, very anxious to hear the lessons that Disaster Patrick has learned as he's dedicated his career and life to this mission, and how we can all be better prepared if suddenly we get a demand to evacuate in the middle of the night due to an imminent disaster heading our way. This falls under the age-old adage of prepare for the worst and hope for the best. So welcome to Petability, Disaster Patrick.
Thank you so much. Excited to be here today. I'm looking forward to our conversation. We're going to make this a lot of fun. So I'm going to talk to people about some really incredible stuff.
How did you get the name Disaster Patrick? Who gave you that name?
When I finished acting as CEO, which is about a year and a half ago, my very first client was a nursing home in the middle of nowhere, South Carolina. So I went to the facility and actually ended up that I became almost like family to them. So actually, even though no matter how big my company got, every year I still would go down personally to do the update, because every year in healthcare facilities, you got to do the training live, got to do the drills live, got to do the equipment live, the whole thing. I did that every single year. And here's the thing is that they had somebody who was working at the facility whose name was, this was their name for her, Hurricane Ruth. Exact words. And I said, why do you call her that? And he said, well, because she was the person who knew the most about hurricanes. She'd been around the area a long time. So and South Carolina does get her hurricanes, periodically. Yeah. So they said, well, she's the expert. And I said, okay, so what am I? And they go, well, you're like Disaster Patrick. And I said, yes, that's what I am. I'm Disaster Patrick.
Yes, I am.
And it stuck. And so every year I came back, they actually stopped using my real name. And they actually said, okay, this is the day Disaster Patrick is coming back, and everybody knew who I was. So it was really nice. It was it was almost like a family pet name. And right. And there you have it. So there you go.
So Patrick, what drew you to disaster preparedness, and specifically as it relates to our pets?
Well, first of all, I was a swimmer in high school. So I used to do the 500, the 1,000, and the mile. Those were my three. Ended up that I became a lifeguard. And then some of the lifeguards said we're going to become EMTs. So I became an EMT. A bunch of them said we're going to become a medic. So I did that. And I was at college at the same time. I studied international politics, international political science when I was in college, because I wanted to actually be a professor. When you study international politics, everybody has something, they have some cause that they really care about. They want to abolish nuclear weapons, or they want peace in the Middle East, or they want, some major geopolitical problem, world famine, something like that. And I didn't have that. I had no idea what mine was. But right after I graduated, and you guys were right, your math was right, Hurricane Katrina was 2005. And it was it was the summer after I graduated college. And as soon as I saw the coverage on Hurricane Katrina, I said, that's it. That's what I'm going to do. I believe this is solvable in my lifetime. The most powerful country, most powerful political unit in the history of humankind still can't handle a Category 5 hurricane, then you know what? There's something wrong here, and we need people to do it. So I wrote a letter to the governor, and I said, listen, I'm a nobody. I'm a total nobody. But I have straight A's. I graduated valedictorian. I'm from my college, and I would like to be a great emergency manager. And they called me. They said, we'd never gotten a letter like this, so come down here. And so I worked, and I ended up living and working in Louisiana for many, many years. And I got to be trained. I worked under the Attorney General. And so I got a chance to really grow as an emergency professional. And then I went to Europe, and I came back, and then I worked with small businesses. And one of that small business types was vets and boarding operations and lots of different, and I was also volunteering to do animal rescue operations as well. So I was volunteering with United Animal Nations, with Humane Society, things like that. And then when I started developing my philosophies, the things I was doing, I said, now is the time, let's apply this to everybody, not just small business owners. Let's apply this to families that have pets of all kinds. And so that's the evolution, and that's where we are now.
How do you get invited into states to rescue? Because I would say that it's not a good idea for the average person to drive themselves into a disaster area. And I know that states are very concerned about having people come in when there's a disaster like that. Do you get invited to come in, or are you allowed to go in legally and start rescuing? How does that work, or what does that look like?
Let me kind of clarify a little bit. So when I do a rescue, in other words, I'm attached to an organization where I'm volunteering with, I actually can't anymore because of some obscure rules now, because of the type of content I create and things. And I can't do that kind of volunteering anymore. I wish I could, but I do support in the command structures. So I'm actually affiliated with an organization called CalVet, which is basically it's a veterinary response team for small and large animals. And I'm not a vet myself, so I don't go onto the direct lines, but I can't, as I said, because of organizational rules and things, I can't go out to do the rescues, but I can help from the command side. So I can assist in making sure teams are organized and people are safe out there. They have the right PPE, making sure they understand demobilization, what happens if someone gets injured, what happens if there's an animal who's injured, things like that. And I help to lead teams now in doing that. And for people who are interested, my suggestion is you should volunteer for the Humane Society or for ASPCA, some organization that does animal rescue. And when you do that for the first time, they will give you the correct training, because you need training. You need to make sure they understand who you are. Right. And they do a background check so that you can appropriately handle the animals and also handle yourself in a disaster zone, which is not something sometimes I think people don't realize how difficult that can really be.
They taught us a little bit of this when I was in veterinary technician school, and not to the extent that you have, but just even setting up quarantine areas and shelter areas, putting some animals next to certain animals and not putting the rabbits next to the dogs and the animals that need to be quarantined next to, younger dogs. So there was so much involved, so much involved.
And it is now gotten to the point where the actual setup of the shelter itself, it's almost standardized. We know now where everything should be generally laid out, what animals can be in next to the other ones. How do we ensure, dealing with the wind and dealing with the elements, dealing with noises, everything is really laid out now. So it's great because we've had enough experience doing these where we now have a pretty solid idea about how they have to run and operate. It's always things to learn. For example, I got hired by a hospital. This is actually one of my first experiences in the leadership side. I was a consultant, and a big hospital system on the East Coast hired me and said, listen, why don't you create our disaster plan? I said, fine, because there's a regulation. Hospitals have to have plans. So I wrote it all up. And then I read in one of their previous disaster experiences that they had a number of physicians and nurses who got bit in the parking lot by animals. And I thought that was very strange. And I asked them about it, and they said, a lot of our nursing staff and a lot of our physicians and a lot of our staff, generally speaking, who are here, own animals. And so what they'll do is they'll leave the animals in their cars with the windows rolled down, of course, and they'll leave them food and water and stuff. The problem is that the animals get distressed because hospital staff have to work. If there's a disaster, you're working, whether you want to work or don't work. There's actually a document you sign in advance that says, I agree to be a hospital worker and I agree to work in a disaster. And so they will leave their animals in there, and the animals will bite people as they are walking past the car windows. They won't even realize there's a dog there, and that happened a number of times. So actually what I did was I designed an animal shelter. I actually consulted with some of the other organizations and said, how do we design these shelters properly? And they gave me best practices, and I actually helped create an animal shelter for a massive hospital. So right there in the parking lot of how to do that. So it's their animals. We know where to get them. How do we do check-in? How do we do check-out? All those things. And then instantly the number of bites from the next disaster, I think, was 0.
That's what we're looking for.
Okay. I can't wait anymore, Disaster Patrick. Please tell us about the miraculous evacuation of 240 cats in 90 minutes. I mean, there's that phrase, there's nothing like herding cats. I mean, it's almost impossible. Yeah. So, this is a true story from the front lines. Do tell.
So one of the things that we were doing was that there is a very large cat sanctuary up here near Sacramento, and it's actually in an undisclosed location. The reason why is because they simply don't want cats to be randomly dropped off at their facility. So these cats live in a sanctuary. It is a really fun sanctuary. So there's little housing units. It feels like tiers in a dorm almost, or in like a military barracks or something. But the cats each have their own little area. And so these are cats that are mostly strays. They were strays, they were feral, and they were brought to the facility. Some of them, a few, were in a home and then something happened to their owners, or they were just dropped off. Okay, so all these cats are living together in this massive sanctuary area. And there's like a little like a stream that runs through it. And it's a beautiful area. It's a beautiful area, but it's very prone to wildfires. So we had to prepare the cats for a wildfire evacuation. This was the challenge. I had to develop a way to evacuate all those cats in 90 minutes because that's how fast wildfires can move in the area where they live. Like actually referred to the emergency plan, actually spoke to the emergency professional in charge of the county. And that was the number he gave me. I said, okay, that's the challenge. Because what they had originally planned to do was, okay, if we have a wildfire, we're going to simply open the gates and do what? Just let them go.
Yeah.
And we didn't want to do that, right? I don't want to do that if we don't have to.
No.
So I said, I'm going to develop a way to move all these cats. And because they were strays, and I told you that part for a reason, because they are notoriously difficult to catch. So I developed a methodology and I said, okay, we're going to do it today. And what we did was I found a way to get the cats to move into their housing areas. Once they were in their housing units, then we were able to quickly go housing unit by housing unit and move them quickly out. Now, one of the techniques that we used, I can't talk about all of them. In fact, you'll have to watch the video. The video is coming out in the last day of May. So when that video comes out, you will see exactly how we did it. It's going to be really fun to watch too. It's going to be very interesting. I had some fun experiences like racing around, and I'm a cat guy. So each cat has its own personality. But so when you're evacuating them, we develop different ways of quickly getting them into the crates and getting them off property. So actually compounding the challenge was we ran out of crates. There actually wasn't enough crates. And so when we were evacuating, we had to very quickly shift and pivot so that we could get them in the cars quickly and get them moved. And so we had to do that. And it was myself and there were 5 others. And so we basically went housing unit by housing unit, and we were able to get them through pillowcases and through other ways, other means of doing it. And we were able to get them all out. And literally, I'm not making this up, we did it with 2 seconds to spare. 2 seconds on the clock, because we were like, because the fire department's going to show up. It doesn't matter what we do. They're going to show up. So we have to get them out in time in 90 minutes, 9-0. And that's what we did. It's about empowering the staff. It really was about them. When you have an organization, when you have so many different people out there working and trying to put these things together, you have people who say, I don't know if I'm really part of the disaster response. I just clean the cat cages. I just do this. I just do that. I point to them. I say, no, you're not doing this. You are going to help us do animal handling. You are going to help us put crates together. And that's the lesson that I give to pet parents around the country is I say, in the end, it doesn't matter what your pet does. It's what you do that matters. It's what you do. And we'll be talking about a few things here in this podcast, I'm sure, is that there are a number of ways that we can help to empower ourselves, to put ourselves in a position where we feel like we can handle this. Because and that's why I decided to do it with the cats, because I'm like, everybody talks about herding cats. And I just said, okay, fine. Then I'm going to herd cats. That's what we're going to do. But it was fun to see that people realized there are other techniques than just opening the gate and letting the cats out. There's another way of doing things. But the question is, how do we design it so that it works that way?
Right. So I want to be clear. When you evacuated the 240 cats with 2 seconds to spare, this was like a drill, right? This was preparing this sanctuary, this cat sanctuary that was in a remote part of Northern California for the disaster.
It was, because they'd never done a drill like that in the past, ever.
Sure.
So they didn't know if it could be done. They didn't know if it could be done.
Right.
But I knew that what we were doing was experimenting, because you don't want to experiment in a real disaster. When we rescued the cats that day, I considered it as just as important as if it's a real thing. In fact, what I tell people all the time is treat a real disaster like a drill, treat a drill like a real disaster.
In your opinion, disaster, Patrick, is the biggest mistake that pet owners make when it comes to preparing for disasters?
They don't create a disaster kit that is specific for every animal. That is going to be the take-home message I give today. You should create a disaster backpack for every single one of your pet family members. Not here's one kit for the cats, here's one for the dogs, here's one for the, fish or the bird or whatever. Every single animal gets their own disaster backpack. Because what happens is when you collectivize it all into one, you don't think about the vagaries of every animal. It's as if I would do that for human beings. I say this to families all the time. There's no such thing as a family disaster kit. If you have a family disaster kit, I don't want you to have a family disaster kit. I want you to destroy it and start over and just pull it apart. And I want you to, every single person gets their own backpack. Every pet you have gets their own backpack. Because once you do that, you now have something that is specific for that animal based on their personalities, based on their needs. So I want people to realize that when they develop their own backpacks for themselves, it should be their backpack for themselves. And then when you turn to your pets, do the same thing. Every single pet gets their own backpack.
It's interesting that you say backpack too. So is that critical that you be hands-free and everything be in a backpack? And if you have to carry one for yourself, your child potentially that maybe is too young to carry their own, and multiple pets, how do you do that? Or are you using the term freely and it could be a bag or some other sort of receptacle?
Well, I actually say backpack but let me kind of elaborate a little bit. I have a system I developed a number of years ago. It's called the 5-pocket method that I use with all my clients, including the ones in my personal portfolio, the ones that I work with consulting one-on-one. They'll fly me to a location. I'll work with them. No matter what, I tell them to use that method because what it does is it gives them every single thing they need to fill up that backpack. Now, I prefer a backpack as a general receptacle only because it's much more portable and easy to use. However, it could simply be a bag, absolutely, as long as it is committed only to disaster supplies. Again, if anything else in it, only disaster supplies. And as long as you're okay with carrying it around, I think that that's fine. But you're right. If you do have children, if you do have yourself and you have a pet, then what you have to do is you have to find the best way possible to be able to move all those things simultaneously. Backpacks tend to work well because, hey, you just put it on your back and you can move it around.
So can we get into the essentials? What should every pet owner have in their backpack?
Okay, so I use the 5-pocket method with people and pets also. So the method is this. You should always have on you. And so I'm going to apply this to a pet. Okay. So when I say you, I'm talking about the pet in the metaphorical sense. Okay. So you should have on you at all times enough with you that you can maximize the number of places for you to be able to evacuate, shelter in place, or lockdown. So if we're talking about an evacuation, we should have enough supplies for our pet so that we could go to Aunt Jane's house, work, school, the American Red Cross shelter, that hotel, whatever. We have to have enough with us that we can maximize those options. Because when people tend to get in trouble in disasters, it's not the size of the disaster. The size of the disaster means very little. When people really get into trouble in disasters is when they are limited in their options. The only option they have is to go to a hotel, and oh, by the way, they have a large dog and they can't bring the large dog into the hotel. And so you know what they have to do? They have to stay in their car, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So that's why I tell everybody you need to apply the method. So when we are talking about our pet families, what we need to do is we need to provide for them everything they need so that wherever we evacuate to, they can come with us. Like that hospital story I was telling you earlier, right? Do we have enough so that if I'm working a 24-hour shift, is the animal being taken care of at the shelter? Can I make that as easy as possible? So the 5-pocket method is this: physical. psychological, personal, papers, phone. Again, physical, psychological, personal, papers, phone. So when we talk about the physical side, so what do they need? So let's just take a dog. Tell me what kind of things physically a dog would probably need.
Food.
That's easy, right? A little bit of water too, I would think.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, so anything else? Medications maybe, right?
Medications, yep.
And so, and the other thing too is just anything that they would need, grooming supplies, whatever, right? So then we talk about the psychological side, and then I always talk about pet toys, right? So having something, and I think a lot of people forget, we need to have their pet toys or ones that are close enough to it that if for some reason we have to rapidly evacuate and we can't grab those things, we have other things in there that they will still relate to because stress, they get stressed as much as anyone else. So the psychological side is so important. So then the next one is personal. So anything that's specific for the dog, talking about leashes or harnesses or whatever you're using, whatever is personal to that animal, that you want to make sure that you have as well. So anything that would be important for them. And then papers are obvious. You want to have some kind of paperwork, work with them. But here's the thing I tell every pet owner, period. I don't care what else you have. Make sure you have done this. You need to take a selfie with your animal, and you need to, if you can, print it out and put it in the disaster kit. If you can't, at least back it up. So have it on your phone and then put it in, your Google Drive or whatever, some other place where you can get to it so that we can identify you and reunite you if we have to. And then the last one is phones. So is there a way we need to be able to know how to communicate with this animal? So like sometimes in shelters before, people would leave notes saying, hey, the animal responds to this name. These are things that tend to make the dog very relaxed. These are that's really important to me, right? So, and the communication is also things like, obviously actually having name tags, right? That's a way of communicating to me what's going on here. So that really helps. So with those things, physical, psychological, personal, papers, and phone, those are the categories of things that allow people to develop a really custom, very easy, but effective pet disaster backpack.
I'm putting mine together now as we speak. I'm trying to put everything together. But it made me think, Chris, back in 2021, we did a whole show on first aid kits, for putting together first aid kits for your pets. So I think that's something that you could put together easily to put into that backpack. You go back and listen to that show and see what's might be essential. Makes me think of the our friends at Heads Up Pets water collar when we think of like situations where there's flooding, things like that. So yeah, take a listen to that episode as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of shows that would support what Patrick is saying, but it's interesting because when he said the 5-pocket method, not necessarily tangible, right? These are like more ideas, and then what's contained, within those 5 pillars. And I'm embarrassed to say, Disaster Patrick, when you said, well, papers are obvious, and I'm like, no. Yeah, not obvious to me. So, what I was thinking of was, again, in a disaster, things like papers themselves are not easily transported. They get wet, burned, dirty, and I guess I was thinking more of like identification things. And you mentioned the selfie. So maybe you can elaborate on papers. And then I'd also like to hear what your thoughts are on forms of ID. You mentioned, having name tags and things like that, but what about microchipping? What about
I'm glad you mentioned that. Microchipping is obviously, that's the best way of doing it, but sometimes people don't microchip. But microchipping is really important. But one of the things I also say is I say this about technology as I say this about anything. I say never rely on one point of failure. So if you are relying on your phone to provide all ways of identifying your animal, that's not enough. So, and same with papers. When people say, I just have papers, I don't have any other way. Well, you need to find some other way of doing it. And you're right. Papers can, quote, burn up, but there's some simple way of handling that. A 1-gallon bag, you just grab one of those, Ziploc bags or whatever. Get some papers from your vet, which basically provide all the basic information about your animal, including some health history, and fold it up just like you would, you were going to fold it into a small envelope. Just fold it up, stick it in there, zip it closed, put it in the backpack. The end. There you go. And that's one way of doing it, but never rely on one way of handling it. So definitely have, as I said, something around their collar. And then, as I said, microchipping is really important. And the photo is a really critical way of doing it because, as I said, anybody can say anything. Oh, that's my animal. And that has happened before, by the way, where people have attempted to steal other people's animals. So that's the reason why it's so important to have that identification, not only for the animal, but also identifying the owner so that we can connect you with them during the reuniting period, because that part, you'd be amazed at how slow and inefficient that can get when you're trying to reunite and they go, that's what, no, is that him? That's no, it's not him. And it just takes a long time. And so developing those kinds of communication is so important for evaluating that. It's not really that hard to do. As I said, just it does take a little bit of work. But again, it's something that's easily dual purposed, and microchipping is something you should try and do anyway. I was actually up in a place called Great Barrington, Massachusetts. I just happened to be around talking with them about all this stuff. And one of the things that they were saying was, we have a lot of great places that have like incense and all that. And actually what I did was, when I created this disaster kit, I literally gave incense sticks to the person I created the kit for, because I said, memory is most closely tied to smell. And so if you're in a hotel room, if you're in your aunt's house, if you're away from home and you're burning an incense stick of something that makes you feel like you're home, like you're smelling something that's like, this is relaxing me. If you close your eyes and you're smelling that, guess what? You're not in that hotel room anymore. You're not in that guest room anymore. You're at home because your mind believes that you're at home. That is what makes a big difference, because it's not even the hassle of people being prepared. It's the fact that people are panicked. People are running around. If everybody could just relax, and it goes same with pet parents, it's the one thing that people neglect all the time. Find something that they can have with them at all times that helps keep them relaxed throughout the process.
Keep them connected to home. That's really good advice. We talked about this in another podcast too, about some things that are calming for animals that we know that we've done studies on. And there are certainly smells that we've studied that can be calming for animals, like lavender.
Really?
Or there were some scents that were calming. And then there was also some music that they proved was calming to shelter animals. So that playing of classical music, harps, flutes.
They negotiate their environment through their nose. And so you may think, oh, I'm going to throw a towel or a blanket or a toy, like you said, Disaster Patrick, in this kit. And, I'd say don't wash it, have something that they've laid on or that does smell familiar to them. And obviously you don't want to take up too much room, but think that a lot of times a towel or a small blanket could be comforting because you could swaddle them in it too. If you're in a sheltering, kind of situation, or, and then they'd also have that smell that comforts them. So, Disaster Patrick, what makes pets more vulnerable in disasters? First thing I thought of was, well, they're dependent on us for a lot of things, but then the other side of that, I thought, well, our pets and animals are born to survive. They have a very keen fight or flight response, and they're survivors, and they'll do whatever it takes. But then I was thinking about like physical things. You brought up the Heads Up Pets water collar, Kathy. If there was a flood, how long can they swim before they become exhausted? In fires and such, their lung capacity, are they particularly vulnerable to smoke inhalation? Do you have any information on pet vulnerability?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, their physiologic needs increase during stressful situations, and I don't think that's news to anybody. I think everybody realizes that. But as I said, one of the things that tends to make it worse is when their pet parents are not prepared. When their pet parents are not prepared for disasters, then that's when they become less prepared for disasters, because just like you said, we have introduced them into our society. We expect them to behave according to a set of standards that we have laid out as human beings. And we ask them in some ways to contradict their own instinct, right? So we ask them to do things that they would not otherwise do. One of the things that I do is I try to get her to adapt, to synergize to the way that I do things. Now, when a disaster occurs, that routine is now disrupted. And when that occurs, they are now just as distressed as we are, and they're looking to us for cues. I don't want you to think of them as dependents. They are not dependents. What they are is they are team members for you, because they are ones that can be an incredible resource for us. So the obvious one is having them around makes us feel better. That's why we have them in the first place. We love having them around, and they're great. So they are just as much a team member as anyone else. The difference is that we have to make sure that we facilitate that for them, that we put them in a position physically, psychologically, personally, through paper identification, which is sort of their legal status and things, and then being able to communicate with them, which is sort of the metaphor of the phone. So that's the 5 Ps. And so when I talk about those things, I do that because I say that's how we best facilitate a team member, just like anything else. It's when you disempower them and say, okay, this animal is simply a weight. They're pulling me down. I have to try to I'm dealing with everything else. Now I'm dealing with them. And so I tell pet parents, I said, what's the best thing you can do to prepare your pets? Prepare yourself first. Prepare yourself. Once you prepare yourself, now it's a whole lot easier. And so one of the things I'm going to be doing, I've actually done this for people already on my YouTube channel. Is that I actually put up 30 days. It starts from day 1, where the backpack is totally empty, to day 30 when we fill the backpack up. And every single day has a different thing of here's what we should fill our backpack with. And one of the other things I'm going to be doing later this year is I'll be doing the same thing for pets. So I'll create 30 videos. I'll be putting them up and starting with day 1 of here's how to start with an empty backpack for your pet family, and then here's how to do it for every single animal all the way to day 30 when it's all done. And one of the things that they'll hear from me as I'm talking is that these are equal participants as you are in the disaster, but the critical element is that you just have to put yourself in a position that you can empower them to be successful. Because once you do that, once you prepare yourself and prepare them for the disaster, you'd be amazed at how much that changes the interpersonal dynamic.
I think the hardest thing, Patrick, thinking about evacuating my own pet is the fear. And how do I stay calm? How do I not project that fear onto my dog, right? That's a hard thing to do.
First decision you have to make in the disaster will impact the outcome of the disaster more than anything else. Should I evacuate, shelter in place, or lockdown? That is the very, very first thing you need to do. And the reason why I pose it like that, as that simple decision that you have to make, is because it focuses you. I want you focused immediately. Are you going to be afraid? Of course you're going to be afraid. It's okay to be afraid. I'm afraid too. I'm not, just because I'm a disaster guy, that doesn't mean I'm instantly not scared. So what I say to folks is I want you to take that fear and do something with it. I want you to channel that into energy. It's okay. Don't fight it. I say to people all the time, don't fight the fear. Don't do that. Channel the fear into energy that you can use to continually make that decision. Because ultimately, in the end, the physiology actually helps you. Because when we get afraid, we start to become hypervigilant. Our heart starts to race more. We get a little bit more adrenaline. We start, we start really hyper-focusing on everything around us. Okay, don't fight that. Don't try to push that away and say, I need to be zen today. You're not going to be zen during a massive wildfire or during a flash flood. Don't try to do that. Instead, focus on the next thing that has to be done and use all that fear, all that focus into making that decision over and over and over again. Because the more times you're able to answer that question successfully, the more likely it is you will be able to successfully get over the disaster. That's the key. And when our pet families are with us, they are part of that. We are worried about them. So let's make sure they're prepared so that we're not afraid for them. We are taking the fear we are working on together and saying, I'm going to channel that into something that makes this really successful. And that's what I say to folks all the time.
I don't understand the difference between locking down and sheltering in place.
So here's the difference. A shelter in place means that essentially what you've decided to do is you're going to stay in an area to avoid a hazard. Okay, because you just don't want to go to an area where there's a hazard. So for example, I had this experience. Okay, I grew up in Orange County, California. I don't know where you two are from, but Orange County, California doesn't get a lot of torrential rains. It just doesn't get a lot of torrential rains. So when I moved to Louisiana, I went to a grocery store. There was actually a market because I used to get fresh produce because I love to cook. So I love to cook fresh stuff all the time. So I used to go to the market. And so one day I went, and as I finished, I filled up the card and I paid for it and everything. And then I noticed there was a bunch of people standing right outside the door, just standing under the overhang. And I looked out and I wondered why. It was a torrential rain that you only get in the swamps because Louisiana's on a swamp. And so it gets rain that is like a shower. It's that heavy. And so everybody was essentially just sheltering in place. They were on their phones, and so some people were smoking, and people were just talking to one another, and some people were fixing up their grocery stuff, but they just stood there. That's what a shelter in place is. You're basically deciding, I'm just going to try to sequester myself away from a hazard easily. A lockdown is different. Lockdown means nobody in, nobody out. There is a life-threatening kind of hazard outside. And it's not just the kind that involves a firearm. We've all been through a massive lockdown. Everyone has. The lockdown is a public health lockdown is called a quarantine. That's what happened during COVID. That's what a lockdown is. It's just basically, that's what a quarantine is. Essentially, it's a public health lockdown. Sometimes you'll hear about chemical spills, and they'll say they've asked everybody to shelter in place. And I would say I was a hazmat guy for a long time. I worked for chemical companies. I did respond to chemical emergencies on the freeway. I did it to fix facilities. And that is not a shelter in place. That is a lockdown. You need to seal yourself up from the outside because those chemicals can be extremely dangerous. So when I talk to people about that, you may decide, okay, I'm going to, it's been an earthquake. Okay, that's easy. I'm just going to evacuate my home. That's easy. So as you're trying to leave, you suddenly smell a lot of natural gas, a ton. And so now you have a decision to make. Should I continue to evacuate and try to get through here? I can't turn my car on because if there's even a spark, that could cause a massive, potentially a combustible situation. Or should I lock myself down in my home? You see how that decision has to constantly be made. And so that's why I always explain to people there are times where you need to harden your house or harden wherever you are. Weirdly enough, I was actually on an airplane and I actually got to experience a lockdown on an airplane. I'd never done it. And I actually explained because the stewardess was like, why are you pursuing this with so much joy? And I said, because I'm a disaster professional and I've never locked down in an airplane before. And I'm watching you guys because I'd love to see how this is done. And so it just gives a sense of here's how we protect ourselves. I just like people to have one of those three options always available to them and as many as you can so that the more you're able to do, the better you're able to protect yourself.
Do you think preparedness looks different for our senior pets or for our special needs pets? We have, Chris and I have a lot of patients who are wheelchairs, amputations, sensory impairments, blindness or deafness. Does that look different for those pets for evacuation?
On a fundamental level, no. On a functional level, yes, of course. So there's a lot more that goes in there. So, for example, when I work with human beings who are paraplegic, quadriplegic, they always ask me, well, am I still in charge of my own disaster? I go, yeah, you are in charge. Even though I can't walk down the stairs myself. Yeah, you're still in charge. So the difference is, though, is that we have to figure out a better way to move you if you can't move yourself. So we're going to talk to your neighbors. We're going to do this. We're going to layer it so that there's always plenty of options so we can maximize your evacuation options. Because if you live in a building and I can't get you out, then I have to find ways to be able to harden you in your apartment. And it's the same with pets. So if we're in a situation where you have pets that simply are non-ambulatory, they can't go down the stairs. So like if you live in a condo, or an apartment and you're on the 10th floor, and that literally I've had this before where this has actually happened with very wealthy people who've actually said this animal can't physically go down the stairs because if the dog has arthritis and I will not leave without the dog. I said, okay, that's fine. Perfectly great. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to find an alternate methodology so that we can get them down the stairs if we have to evacuate. So whatever we need to do, we are going to do those things. And actually, I actually created a sled for them. We actually designed and actually purchased a sled so that the dog could lay in the sled, and we actually could slide the dog down the stairs as she went down the stairs. So that, but again, it just adds that additional layer. But on a foundational philosophical level, I don't change one bit. I don't move an inch. You still have to have specific disaster protocols for them. They are still a team member. They're just one that needs a little extra guidance, a little extra support.
Right. And going back to the 5-pocket method, the things that they need given their situation. Yep.
You got it.
So I think I know the answer to this, but I'll let you expound. What if a disaster strikes and you're not home and the dogs are there or the pets are there by themselves?
Okay. So what do you think?
I think that you have prepared by having your backpack ready with the 5-pocket method, and you have neighbors and somebody close by that could assist in the evacuation or shelter in place or whatever needs to be.
You got it. And that's the reason why they need to have their own backpack. That's why. Because if you have a neighbor come in, the neighbor's not going to know every little thing, right? That they're going to need. So instead, you have a backpack. This is my animal's backpack. Just this animal, or if they're working with a multi-pet household, especially different species, you're looking at people who are going to walk in. They may not be experts. They may not know, but you know what? If that backpack is well organized and everything's in there, now you can instantly empower them. You're empowering them to empower your animal.
Yeah.
Right. So you've done that. So you hit that just right in the head. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, sometimes the neighbor calls on me. She has a couple of golden doodles, and she's like, "Oh, I'm not going to make it home. Can you let them out, or can you feed them?" And it sounds simple enough. But I go over there and I'm like, okay, which bowl is Charlie's and which one is Bear's? And do I let them out first, or which I made a mistake? She said, "Can you feed them and let them out?" Well, yes, I took that literally. So I fed them, and Bear was still a very, pretty young puppy. And I look over, and at his feeding dish, he is urinating. So I'm like, I should have let them out and then fed them. So the more detailed that you can be in your, disaster preparedness, it'll take a lot of anxiety off of anybody that may be assisting you.
Right. Well, and that's the reason why that part I talk about the phone, the communication, that's when I talk about that with that. That's why I say have some kind of a behavior sheet in there so that we understand, so that somebody who's a shelter worker who doesn't know anything about them, doesn't know anything about your animal at all, at least has a basic understanding. But you hit on exactly the reason why I say to pet owners around the country, I don't care, one pet, one dog, 3 species, I don't care. Everyone gets their own backpack so that we can customize them, because then now it's a lot easier for someone like you to be successful when they aren't home. Because imagine if you'd have had an earthquake.
Yeah.
And now you have to deal with all this stuff on top of everything else. Not only you have to learn
Where's
the normal
their
behavior
leash?
patterns. Now you got
where do they keep their food? Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
And so for the veterinary professionals out there, is there one piece of advice, Disaster Patrick, that you would give them to share with their clientele to help them be most prepared? I guess, in other words, like providing maybe a med sheet, or, just in terms of a medical condition or something, that what is imperative and what they should be thinking about.
Instead of the vet or the vet professional expecting their clients to reach out to them about that one sheet or those two sheets, they should be very proactive, and they should add that into their SOPs when they are interacting in patient care.
Standard operating procedures for those of you who don't know.
I apologize. Standard operating procedure. So in other words, whether it's intake and really intake is the best point, because then what you can do is you can train your staff to say, listen, this is something we do standard. We give you this sheet. Please include it in their disaster kits. Okay, because sometimes they're not going to ask you. They may not know that you even know to ask. Right. So if you provide that to them, that makes that conversation so much easier. And it makes it clear that we as an organization, and I use that word organization as broadly as I can, because this could be a boarding facility, this could be a vet care, it doesn't matter, is we say our organization cares about your pet's disaster preparedness, and we care enough that we are giving you a piece of information that's going to be important. And so, and the other thing is that I say this to every vet. I've actually spoken to a couple of vet conferences. I literally have said this every year when they come in for their annual checkup, hand them that sheet again, the brand new sheet. Because obviously animals can change, right? Physiologically, they change. They get arthritis, they get cancer, they get ill, they're on a medication, they got an eye infection, whatever. They're a little bit more cranky in their old age. I mean, that happened to my cats. I mean, they just get that way. So every year, give them that sheet. This is your annual disaster sheet.
So that sheet being like their medical conditions, the medications that are required, et cetera, right?
Right. And also, I like to have something in there. I actually have done this with facilities I've worked with, have something called behavior notes, because that actually helps, because it'll say things like, can't be handled by more than one person. Yeah, exactly.
Fractious
or
cat.
Fractious cat, right, exactly. Or bites if you touch their head, right? So, I mean, those are notes that tend to be helpful, because they not only help the vet, they also help an employee who may be dealing with the animal, because in a disaster, they may actually bring the animal to the vet, and they may be dealing with a vet tech that maybe they hadn't worked with before or whatever. And there's no access to the computers. The computers are not accessible, anything like that. So every single one of those times, you want to make sure that you are putting people in a position where they have the most information. So that is something I say, and I say every single year, give them an updated version of that.
So one just final question regarding that. I would think that critical medication should be in that disaster kit.
Mm-hmm.
However, medications expire. They need to be kept in maybe a refrigerator or something like that. So when you say like this annual update, I would assume that you're also saying like check expirations and replace with those that are not. When you have the medication list in there, maybe it's highlighted like in fridge, door right side or something like that. Would that be kind of closing that loop on meds?
Yeah, I think first of all, you should have a notation in there. So in other words, if you have that 1 gallon Ziploc bag I was telling you about, and you've thrown their annual in there, and you've been doing it annual, but then in the middle of the year, they get ill for some reason, or they're at a point where you have to do this or that. Okay, so get that med list and throw it in there, because during disasters, just like in human healthcare, there will be a point where medications can be obtained in advance. So, for example, not every disaster is going to occur in an instant. I mean, these are things like hurricanes, where these are telegraphed disasters. In advance they're going to occur. 3 days advance, 4 days advance, 5 days in advance. So that's the point where you can begin to increase the number of meds. And then also it is at that point where if they have to be refrigerated, then you want to find a way that you want to get a small cooler, or you want to find some way to make sure that you can transport. Again, you want to maximize the number of places you can evacuate to, shelter in place, and lock down. Because if you don't have enough of a cooler, where if you say, I'm going to evacuate 50 miles away, okay, fine, but the cooler you have won't hold the medication that long, now you have limited your options. That option is now potentially out, right? So that's why we want to think in advance. How do we ensure that we have the meds? Now, are you going to actually put them in the disaster kit in advance? No. I actually do have a family, though, that actually does this. They actually keep the animals' medications they always are kept in the disaster kit. That is actually where they're stored, except the ones have to be in the fridge, obviously. But all the other ones, they actually put them in a side pouch in the disaster backpack, because they just say, first of all, it helps me to know where the kit is. And the other thing is it means if there's a disaster, I don't have to go fumbling for it. Those are the things that I tend to recommend when it comes to pharmacy.
Thank you, Disaster Patrick. It's been really eye-opening for me. I need to get my dog's preparedness kit together, but that's the key to the successful evacuation or the successful lockdown, is to be prepared and to be ready. I think I would just add into that if there is a disaster, it's good to have a list of close by or not so close by, animal emergency rooms and just check and see what's in your area. Urgent care, ERs, things like that. So I think that's also important. And you can put that you can put that in one of the 5 pockets, the list of your, the emergency
and
room
on your phone. You have to have multiple ways.
On your phone. So
right. We're learning. We're always growing over here at Petability.
So as we're wrapping up, Patrick, can you let our listeners know where can they find you? Where can they get information from you?
Well, they can find me at disasterpatrick.com. Again, disasterpatrick, no spaces, underlines, anything.com. So the other place to catch me is at my YouTube channel, and my handle is Disaster Patrick, and you can catch a ton of great content, including the one about the cats at the end of the month. And in the meantime, throughout the month of May, I'll be providing a ton of pet content about how best to prepare your animals for disasters. And sort of the last thing I'll say, and I'll hand it back, is this is something I say all the time, whether I go on television or I go on YouTube, or if I'm talking on a wonderful podcast like the one that I'm on today, is I want you to remember something. Disasters don't have to be doom and gloom. They don't have to be blood and guts. They don't have to be awful and scary. They don't have to be any of those things. This is the advice I would give to you. Prepare for a disaster, and you'll never experience one. If you put yourself in a position where you are truly preparing for any disaster, I believe firmly in my heart that you will never, ever, ever have to experience one, nor will anyone in your pet families. Thank you so much for having me. Enjoyed it.
Thank you, Patrick. That was great advice. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Patrick.